Over here, we have topic 2, matter and energy in organisms and ecosystems. Right at the top, I have the first standard that we'll be covering. Remember, the standards very frequently link to the type of sentence starters that you will see on the exam. So it's important that you understand what is being asked, so therefore you can answer the questions appropriately. It says, construct and revise an explanation based on evidence for how carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, remember all of those are going to be elements, from sugar molecules may combine with other elements such as nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus to form amino acids and other carbon-based molecules. This has been asked on at least 2 of the 3 exams that we have seen so far. The first bullet point is looking at matter and energy. Remember, matter is anything that takes up space and has mass. That would include solids, liquids, and gases. Yes, even gases like carbon dioxide and oxygen. Think about when you blow up a balloon and how once you inflate the balloon, it now has a bigger volume. That's because that gas does take up space and also has mass associated with it. The other thing we're going to look at is energy flow. Energy flow is looking at how we go from solar energy to chemical energy. The chemical energy that we're going to be focusing on is glucose, which is a simple sugar, and then how that simple sugar gets converted or transformed into usable energy, which is known as ATP. So as matter and energy flow through different organizational levels of living systems, chemical elements are recombined in different ways to form different products. Listed here, I have the 5. Yes, I've added one, so you should probably do the same on your worksheet. Hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, and phosphorus. Those are going to be the elements that we are most interested in. When I put some of those elements together, I can make different compounds. Some of the compounds that we're familiar with would be glucose, amino acids, DNA, and lipids. Now this picture or model that I have located here was on the first exam that they offered. It says sugar molecules like glucose, C6H12O6. Look here, I have those same elements, my carbon, my hydrogen, my oxygen. Remember, the number next to them is just referring to how many I have of each of the elements. What winds up happening is sugar has just those 3 elements. When you eat sugar, right, that could be from fruit, that could be from milk, that could be from anything that has sugar associated with it. Your body is going to take those elements get rearranged, and then you can make different products, right? So the input is sugar. That sugar gets broken down. The building blocks then can be reused in order to make different types of compounds. Here it talks about hydrocarbon backbone. Hydrocarbon backbone, the hydro is referring to hydrogen, and then the carbon is referring to, well, carbon. So we have hydrogen and carbon. If I take my carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and I rearrange them, and then I combined them with nitrogen, I would have made a amino acid. Now, whenever I think nitrogen, I know that a protein is going to have nitrogen in it. I also know that DNA has nitrogen in it. Sugars and fats do not have nitrogen. Looking at this model, I start on glucose. Glucose is a simple sugar. And this glucose is made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. At this point, I do not believe you're going to have to know the numbers that follow, but you will have to be able to recognize it. So if you see that formula on a test, you're going to have to know, ooh, that's glucose. But if you have to write an input for something, you'll just be able to write down sugar, glucose, or if you know the chemical formula, you can write that down as well. Glucose, we built these models in class. They were somewhat complex to make, but in a simple structure, you would see that it's just going to be made up of 6 sides. When I have a lot of glucose molecules together, which is glucose is a simple sugar, when I put many of those together, I make a complex sugar. That complex sugar is going to be known as starch. So if I put a lot of building blocks together and I bond them together, then I can make a storage molecule known as starch. Now I did the ... to just show you that it continues on to the left and the right. This is a complex sugar, where glucose would be referred to as a simple sugar. Going back to my box in the middle, which has my elements, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. On my right-hand side, I have my lipids. If you don't remember what a lipid is just a fancy word for fats. And just like glucose is made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen only, lipids are also made up of only carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Following along on my boxes, the next thing that I would note is that this has a plus sign and then I've got nitrogen. When I'm thinking about what I need to add in order to make a protein, I always think N in protein means I need to add a nitrogen. Another thing I like to do when I'm annotating different types of models is I think, ooh, protein's the big molecule, what would be the small molecule? Making these types of connections on the test is going to better allow you to answer the questions. So when I put together a lot of amino acids and I bond them together, then I make a protein. Amino acids and proteins are both made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and then nitrogen. The last one we have on the left-hand side is you will see that that is going to be my DNA. DNA also has that N associated with it. N just meaning nitrogen. But now we also have the phosphorus added. So carbon, hydrogen, oxygen plus nitrogen gives you a protein. And then carbon, hydrogen, oxygen plus nitrogen and phosphorus is going to give you DNA. Due to chemical reactions such as digestion and synthesis, energy is transferred from one system of interacting molecules to another. Remember, digestion means to break apart. And then synthesis means to produce. A big thing with this curriculum is making sure that you know those kind of non-sciencey words. They're called Tier 2 words. If you look on the first page of this packet, I have many of the Tier 2 words that I think you might be struggling with listed. I suggest that you make sure that you know those. Our next standard, which has to do with matter and energy, is going to refer to photosynthesis. Use a model to illustrate how photosynthesis transforms light energy into stored chemical energy. When I see the word photosynthesis, I like to break that word apart into its 2 affixes. So I've got photo. That word photo actually means light. And as I defined up here, synthesis means to produce. So we are going to use light, or plants use light, in order to undergo photosynthesis and make food. A fancy definition that you might see is that photosynthesis is a process that captures light energy carbon dioxide, and water and converts it into oxygen and sugar. This long-winded sentence is really just the equation that's represented here. If you think something is a photosynthesis question, you want to pause and take a minute and write down the formula. Every time I'm thinking, what do plants need in order to make food, I'm writing down that photosynthesis equation every single time. You need to memorize this. This picture or model that I have right here was on the Regents exam. This was a gimme question. Over here on my left-hand side, the things that are going into the reaction, remember those are called inputs. And then the things that are coming out on the right-hand side, those are going to be the outputs. It is helpful to slow down and make sure you're labeling all of the things. As I said before, this sentence is really just this formula in fancy terms. Look here, I've got my light, my carbon dioxide, and my water. All of those are my inputs. It's saying it's capturing those things, bringing those things in. Then it says it converts it into oxygen and sugar. Again, those are my outputs. So the inputs are the ingredients that I need, and then the outputs are my products that I make. One thing that you want to make sure you understand, because I've seen this as well, is that however many carbon I start with, that's how many carbon I end with. So looking here, I have 6 carbon. If I go all the way to the right-hand side, I can see I also have C6. That indicates I have 6 carbon. If I look at, let's say, the hydrogen, here I have a 2. Don't be fooled by that. It's really 6 times 2. That gives me 12. And then on this side, I have H12. I also have 12. So note, matter, in this case, when we're talking about matter, we're talking about the number of elements on both sides remains the same. Now, sometimes when they say that, they might say that we're conserving, right? Conserving just means to save. We have the same number of elements on both sides. Right below there, we have the types of organisms that are able to undergo photosynthesis. Producers, autotrophs. If you're still struggling with that word autotroph, remember we always want to break the words apart. We have auto. Auto means self. And then troph means feeder. Plants are capable of feeding themselves. And by that, we mean inside of their cells, they're able to take carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight, and they convert that into glucose, which is their food. So we're not talking about they're going making themselves a sandwich, right? We're saying that they're able to make food within their cells. Other things that we want to keep in mind, right? Producers, other words you might see that have to do with producers could be plant. You might see algae. You also might see phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are just going to be the producers that are living in lakes, rivers, streams, right on the surface there. So photosynthesis, we're memorizing the equation and we're making sure we know the vocabulary like producers and autotroph. This question here is having us look at a model. I took this right from the Regents. Note on the left-hand side, it has your inputs. On the right-hand side, it has your outputs. Ooh, I see that word photosynthesis. First thing I do every time is I break apart that word. So I know I'm using light to produce something. In this case, right, it's always going to be to produce food. So we're using light to produce food. This is only asking you to write down that formula that we just saw on the last page. My hint here, if you didn't see, right, the model is sometimes going to give you hints. It's telling me the light energy is coming in. Then it gives me my inputs and my outputs. My inputs on the left-hand side. What do plants need in order to make food? They need carbon dioxide and they need water. And then on my right-hand side, they're going to make oxygen and then they make glucose. I'm only writing the formulas here so that in case you see them, you can remember what is what. Remember, if I end with a carbon, that means in the beginning I had to start with a carbon. Notice I did not put the coefficient in front of it. That is not necessary. You also could just write down the words, carbon dioxide. Don't fall into the trap where you just write carbon, right? Carbon dioxide, you have to write the whole thing. The last thing I'm going to note is that here it's light energy, and then in the end, the glucose is going to be my chemical energy. You want to make sure that you know how the energy is converted or transformed. So they might talk about it as energy being converted or energy being transformed. We go from light energy to chemical energy. The next part of this is looking at respiration. This is sometimes when it gets confusing because the formulas look very, very similar. If you're unsure what formula, write them both down. We have aerobic respiration. When I see arrow up here, I think oxygen, so I immediately write that down. Spire, actually, that root right there, that means to breathe. So we're talking about to breathe oxygen. First thing that you see is that there's a long sentence. This long sentence is, in fact, just the formula. So if you were to see this on the test, what you would want to do is be like, oh, I got to keep track of what's going on here. Always write down the two formulas, the respiration formula and then the photosynthesis formula. The definition says this is a process by which the bonds of food molecules, those food molecules, that really just means sugar or glucose, and oxygen molecules are broken and new compounds are formed. In this process, ATP is produced, which is used to carry out life functions. ATP is usable chemical energy. Again, take time, memorize this formula. If I took this right off of a test that already happened. These are easy points. If I'm looking on my left-hand side, input. Right-hand side, output. If I was to count up how many carbon, how many oxygen, how many hydrogen on both sides, I would notice, once again, matter is conserved. Remember, when I'm saying it's conserved, I mean the number of carbon and the number of oxygen and hydrogen stays the same on the left-hand side and then on the right-hand side. This fancy sentence is just this formula. If the sentences sound confusing, take a second, pause, write down the formula. Keep in mind this glucose is my chemical energy. And then over here, my ATP is my usable chemical energy. There might be a question, where did this energy originally come from? You got to go back. Where did we get the energy for the glucose? Oh, the energy from the glucose originally came from the sun. Lots of times we get these formulas confused. But if we're looking, they're really just flip-flopped. And remember, if you start with carbon on one side, carbon dioxide, you've got to make sure you've got the other type of carbon on the output side. In this case, glucose. So over here, I've got carbon dioxide and water. Those are my inputs for photosynthesis. If I look down here, I would notice, oh wow, those are my outputs for respiration. They are just flip-flopped. Now, every organism, right, plants, animals, fungi, they are all going to have a mitochondria. The mighty mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell and is responsible for making ATP. Responsible for making ATP. Here, I have a model. This actually is supposed to be a mitochondria. So if you're thinking, what is that? This is my mitochondria. Sometimes when I draw the mitochondria, I just make it look like a little squiggly line on the inside, and I think that kind of looks like a script M if I'm using my imagination. I'm not actually a good artist, but over here, squiggly, 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 squiggly. When I see a picture like this, the first thing I want to do is think, are the arrows inputs or outputs? You could label those with like a little I or an O. This one's going in, so I know it's an input. This one's also going in, so I know it's an input. These two coming out, output. This over here, output. You're going to use that formula right from the top and then just apply it. So again, you wrote down that formula, you know it. You can just stick in the values as needed. Input, glucose, oxygen. Don't get hung up on where they need to go. Inputs are going in no matter what. Just put them going in. Outputs are what's coming out. CO2, ATP, H2O. If, let's say, you did this by yourself and you flip-flopped and put glucose here and oxygen there, does not matter. It's all the same. Now we're moving on to some of that carbon cycling. This is going to put both our respiration and our photosynthesis together. Actually, real quick before we do that, you know what's not on here? Anaerobic respiration. I forgot to put it. And that is part of one of the standards. Now, if you didn't have me as a teacher this year and you're not too familiar with how to break apart words, I've got my AN and then my air. We already said up on top, air means oxygen. If you ever have an A in front of something, though, that negates it. So AN or just A, that's negating. This means no oxygen. That's key, anaerobic respiration. Now, you can do anaerobic respiration. You're exercising, you get like a little cramp in your side. You're undergoing anaerobic respiration right there because you're making something called lactic acid. That's what humans make when they undergo anaerobic respiration. If you are a bacteria and you're undergoing anaerobic respiration, which is what you're doing all the time, you actually are fermenting, and that is how you get things like yogurt. Right, so you get things like yogurt. It's also how they make things like beer, wine, anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration could also help with the production of things like bread. Yeast frequently undergo anaerobic respiration, and then you wind up having the bubbles that form in the bread. When those bubbles form in the bread, those are just little pockets of carbon dioxide. Those are the outputs. So anaerobic respiration means no ATP. The problem with anaerobic respiration is that you make less ATP. Because if you were thinking like, hey, I can do anaerobic respiration, but I thought if I didn't have oxygen, I would die. Yes, true. The thing is that anaerobic respiration does not allow you to make enough ATP to be alive as a complex organism. If you're a little tiny bacteria, you are good to go. But humans, long-term, cannot do anaerobic respiration. So moving on to the next standard, which is still connected to this. This is bringing all of the things together. And I kind of just grouped these two together because they're similar, a little bit different, but we'll try to hit on all the things you need to know. This again, picture from the Regents. Always label the models. Do not think, I'm just going to figure this out as I go. No, do not do that. Look at the model and try to label immediately. Over here, I've got plants, and this is saying carbon dioxide. So I know carbon dioxide. Over here, look, this is going into the plant. I know that's an input then. This is an input because it's going in. Input. And in this case, it told me carbon dioxide. Ooh, what process do plants use carbon dioxide for? Photosynthesis. Write that down. They're going to get confusing on those questions and be like looking at process A, and you're going to have to flip back, and then you're going to have to switch on the brain and be like, what is process A? Go through, label the pictures right away. So over here I have plants. Remember, plants are producers or autotrophs, and they do both photosynthesis and respiration. Let's make a little note. So producers, again, try to use all of the synonyms like interchangeably so you get more familiar with them. And I just abbreviated photosynthesis. So moving along, now I've got plants to animals. Keep in mind, the animals are eating the plants. Also note the arrow, so I know this is an input. When animals eat plants, what are they getting out of that? Well, they're getting food. So over here, this is going to be that carbon dioxide got converted into glucose, and now the animals are eating the glucose. When they eat the glucose, this process, when they go glucose to releasing carbon dioxide, because now look, this is my output. Right, so input glucose, output carbon dioxide. This process here is respiration. Follow the arrows. Follow the arrows. Over here, this is also respiration because plants, while they make glucose, they automatically undergo respiration. They don't need to eat anything, and then it loops back around and they produce carbon dioxide. The last one we have here is when they die. When they die, this process X is going to be decomposition. I would mark up all the models. Down below, I did put some additional things for you to actually write stuff. You don't have to take the time to do that on the actual test. But process A, we said, was photosynthesis. Remember, photo means light, synthesis means to make. This one here is supposed to be really focusing in on the carbon cycle. So that is going to be what my focus is here. Process B is respiration. And this is plants and animals. Use glucose, which is C6H12O6, and release CO2. And again, I'm following that carbon. Process X And this is crazy, right? A, B, and then they have X. I don't know why they do that. Decomposition. And that's going to be when bacteria or fungi, like a mushroom or a mold, break down dead organisms and recycle. They recycle all those elements, right? Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. You could see something about how nitrogen goes back into the soil, and then the plants use the nitrogen as a fertilizer, and that allows them to grow bigger too. So keep that in mind. But for this one, I'm trying to follow the carbon because that's what the standard is talking about. Carbon dioxide, glucose, and then when you die, all of your elements get recycled back into the soil. And if you didn't know those were elements, just jot that down. And the last one is combustion. I don't have combustion on here, but you could see it. Combustion is burning fossil fuels. And when you burn fossil fuels, you release CO2. Because fossil fuels, those are coal, oil, gas. When things die, like things died a long time ago, like dinosaurs, there was a lot of pressure on their fossils, right, as the soil levels built up. And that causes the formation of fossil fuels. And that takes millions of years. Those were stored, that carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen was stored in the geosphere. And now, when we burn them, they get released, all those things that had been stored long-term, deep down. Now that carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen is getting released into the atmosphere. The last piece of vocabulary that we need to know, they love the spheres. If you don't know the spheres, you got to memorize them. We got biosphere. Bio means life. So anything that's living. Plants, animals, bacteria, fungi. Atmo. The atmo means the air. Hydro, exactly what it sounds like. Hydro is referring to water. So lakes, rivers, oceans, etc. And then geo. Geo is referring to rocks, soil. Now over here, this is just like a little bit of a better version of kind of some of that cycling. If you don't know the spheres, you have to memorize them. I would say you at least have to know two by heart, like what they are, because from what I've seen so far, they will always have you identify how two spheres interact. How two spheres interact. If we're looking at the biosphere, I'm just going to kind of make a little thing, right? Plants take in and give off carbon dioxide. They take in carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, and then they release carbon dioxide through respiration. So this is my photosynthesis piece, this is my respiration piece. When there's a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it can do something called diffuse or diffusion into the hydrosphere. Maybe you've done some sample clusters about how there's carbon dioxide diffuses into the hydrosphere. That makes the water more acidic, right? The ocean more acidic. When the ocean's more acidic, the coral shells can't be formed properly, and therefore the coral die. And that goes for anything that is made of a shell. right? The shell, if you can't form the shell, that's going to affect your stability, and then that could lead to death. Another thing we have is when things die, their elements, building blocks get recycled. That's that decomposition. Over here, I'm going to draw a little factory. Again, I am really good at drawing. And when the factories burn fossil fuels, they release carbon dioxide. Same thing when you drive a car, you release carbon dioxide. And the last one, yes, I know my human is just as big as my factory. It makes literally no sense, but it is what it is. There's my human. My human also releases carbon dioxide, and that's through that process of respiration. So plants' biosphere, humans' biosphere. Keep in mind when you're burning fossil fuels, that's coal, oil, and gas. Those are all the remains of the dead organisms. You also could use a picture similar for this for the nitrogen cycle, if that pops up. Carbon sequestration, that's been on a few tests so far. When you see that word sequestration, and you might never have seen that word before, it looks like they have been defining it for you. But over here we have the root sequester. When you sequester something, you trap it. In everyday terms, you might have heard the word sequester potentially for jury duty. If it's a really high profile case, they might sequester the people on the jury, and then they force them to stay in a hotel, and they limit their access to things like television, their phones, social media, so therefore they cannot be swayed by what's going on in the outside. So sequester means to trap. It's a process of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it in one of the carbon pools. Carbon pools are where you can store carbon. So here we have the atmosphere. That should probably be crossed off. But plants and trees during photosynthesis, they capture that carbon, and then that carbon gets trapped inside of them. Think about a big tree. Big tree, those trees are holding on to lots of carbon. Soil, that can trap carbon. The ocean, through that process of diffusion that we looked at on the last page, and then fossil fuels underground. We're currently having a problem because we have less trees due to deforestation, and less trees mean less CO2 sequestration. Now keep in mind, we need to be able to trap that carbon, because when you have an increase in atmospheric CO2, that leads to climate change. So two things. One, climate change. Climate change can be an increase in temperature, but it also could be just the fact, like, not that it's warmer, but the weather is just crazier. Like more hurricanes, more forest fires happen. You have more droughts that are occurring. The other thing, when you get too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it diffuses into the ocean. And when it diffuses into the ocean, that leads to ocean acidification. Now, in my class, we talked about ocean acidification. That's when it becomes more and more acidic. The values for acids or anything, if it is less than 7, that's an acid. When it becomes too acidic, like I said, you either get fish kills, meaning lots of fish all die at the same time, or you could wind up having animals with shells unable to make those shells, and then that affects their homeostasis and they wind up dying. They might give you on the test some human-designed method. That would all be provided in the reading, and you would have to just use your reading comprehension skills in order to figure out the constraints and the criteria for those human-designed methods. They'll probably give you a chart or a passage to read through. Over here, we have two more models, just similar to what we already did. It says use mathematical representations to support claims. Mathematical, you know you need a number. Quantitative, we've been saying this the whole year, but if it ever says quantitative, you need some sort of number. Keep in mind on this test, and this was an issue with the June 2025 test, they needed a quantitative data. And I know a lot of my students were looking for it on that page, which would make sense. But in actuality, you had to flip back 2 pages to find the numbers. It might have actually been this exact picture. So keep in mind, you are going to have to go on what I like to call a scavenger hunt in order to find the numbers. If it says quantitative, do not answer the question and leave out numbers because it's automatically 0 points. Quantitative means you need a number. You might need to flip through the entire cluster to find that number, but it will be there. Oh, and over here, look. This was just in the last standard. It's here too. Hydrosphere, atmosphere, geosphere, biosphere. You got to know those words. It's in 2 or 3 of the standards. They're expecting you to know that. When we're talking about the cycling of matter, keep in mind matter refers to my elements. So that's carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, although I don't see too much stuff on phosphorus. And then energy, which we'll look at on the next page. That's going to be light to sugar to ATP. What I would suggest you do is label all the things just like last time. So here I notice sunlight going in, stuff coming out. Sunlight going in, I know that's a photosynthesis. This is my mitochondria. Remember I said look for that little squiggly M, like the script M. So I know the mitochondria undergoes respiration. Notice they have both the cow and the plant. They're both doing that. Other words I think maybe we don't know. When you emit something, it means given off. And then over here it says nutrients added to the soil. What's process C? It says dead organisms. That's again going to be decomposition. And keep in mind the nutrients for the soil, that's just carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. Right, so right there. Keep in mind, just as a little bit of review, this is how water goes in. And then once those dead things die, that's also how the nitrogen, natural fertilizer, go, right here the nitrogen goes in that way. Again, plants and animals both undergo both undergo respiration. Last page that we have for this section is energy flow. We have energy flow and cycling of matter. Energy flows in one direction. Ecosystems need a continuous input of solar energy. So if the sun goes out, you're out of luck. Right? The sun goes out, you're not going to be able to have that continuous input, and then organisms are going to wind up dying. Plants, phytoplankton, or algae. Also keep in mind, these would be producers and autotrophs. Again, keep looping those words together so that when you see them on the test, they make more sense. What I tell my students to do is change out the words. If you see producer or autotroph, and every time you have to think, oh, what is an autotroph? Just change it to plants. It probably doesn't matter because it'll just decrease the mental load for you, that cognitive load, and it will make it a lot easier for you to answer the questions. We've got plants, phytoplankton, algae make up the lowest level of the food web and of the energy pyramid. They also contain the most energy. Let's go down to our energy pyramid or biomass pyramid. You could use either of those terms. Biomass, bio, living, mass, amount, right? Total number of living things. What I would suggest you do is here it says producer. On the top, I said plants, phytoplankton, algae. You might want to label that if that's helpful to you. Notice this is the base and it is the largest. This one producers have the most mass and they also have the most energy associated with them. Notice on this side, I have my energy flow. Energy flows only in one direction. Producer, herbivore, carnivore. If you don't know these words, herbivore, carnivore, you probably want to make sure that you learn them. Herbivore, eat plants. Carnivore, eat animals. Could you see omnivore? Yes, that prefix omni means all. Omni means all. Now note, these producers get their energy directly from the sun. Producers undergo photosynthesis, light to make energy, right? They use light energy to make food energy. It says, at each link upward in a food web, only a small fraction of energy is consumed. Consumed means eat. It's going to be eaten at the lower trophic level. Ooh, man, do we know what trophic level means? Trophic, just like autotroph, heterotroph. Trophic level means feeding level. Only about 10% is transferred up to the next level. To produce growth and release energy through cellular respiration at the higher levels. Let's mark that up. As I go up, what winds up happening is that in each one of these levels, only 10% moves up to the next level. Each level only gets 10%. The rest of it is just gone. Bye-bye. It's lost. Why is it lost? 3 reasons. Heat. Think about yourself. If you're standing next to someone, especially like on a hot day or even a cold day, people are always giving off heat, right? They're giving off heat. On a hot day, you're like, oh, get away from me. You're so hot, right? Like, because they're sweaty, you're sweaty. They're giving off heat. You want them away from you. So all organisms are giving off heat. Another thing, feces, poop. That's how lots of energy is lost. And the last one is respiration. The actual process of respiration, sorry that's blurry. The actual process of respiration gives off energy, right? You lose energy. The only energy that gets passed on to the next level is the energy, right? The mass that gets stuck to your body. So you eat food, you're giving off heat. Some of the food you eat you can't even digest, and then a lot of the energy is being used in order to produce ATP. When you use up that ATP energy, it's gone. It's gone. You went outside, ran, played sports, went on a walk, just sat there and did nothing. You needed energy for all of those things. That energy gone. The only energy that herbivores get from producers is from the actual mass of the plant. The only energy that carnivores get from herbivores is whatever is stuck to the herbivore, right? Like the mass, the muscle, the fat that the carnivore eats. So again, energy is lost. The main ways energy is lost is thermal or heat, feces, and from metabolic process like respiration. Given this inefficiency, there's another word, maybe we don't know that. Inefficiency means that you're wasting. Someone who's like really efficient, gets things done, without like wasting time, right? They're very good at their job or at their task. If something's inefficient, not the same, right? They're being pretty wasteful and most of the things are being lost. Their time is not being used properly. So over here, given this inefficiency, meaning only 10% gets moved up, 90% is gone, there are generally fewer organisms at higher levels of the food web. For an ecosystem to be stable, there has to be more producers than top-level consumers. And then the last thing we have is really that biomass. Bio means life. And then for mass, we're talking about like number of organisms, the weight of the organisms. So you'll see producers have the most biomass. But then as I move up to the top, like a top-level carnivore, they have the least amount of mass per square meter. So usually you have the most producers. That's what you're looking for. If the producers suddenly get cut in half, everything else gets cut in half. And you'll notice here when I was talking about 90% lost, you'll see that's the same thing that happens really with the biomass. You've got 1,000, move the decimal place over, only 10%, only 10%, only 10%. So the mass is also decreasing. Okay, matter. Remember, matter is my carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, and the ecosystem is conserved. These are going to be the words that get you guys. I think a lot of us know the science, but it's the words that are the tricky part. So matter, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, is conserved, meaning saved. The chemical elements that make up the molecules of organisms pass through food webs and into and out of the atmosphere and soil, and they are combined and recombined in different ways. This is really just saying that when I look on the previous page, right, what's happening to the carbon? Some of the carbon is being taken in by the plant, then some carbon is being given off. Over here, when this plant dies, then that gets put into the soil or the geosphere. So this is just showing you how you cycle, but however many carbon you started with, that's how many you end with. And the way I know that, right, 60, 60, those numbers, when I add those up, those are real close to that 120, right, real close to that 123. So we're having matter conversions. Matter gets converted, but it's conserved, meaning it stays the same, stays the same. When matter is cycled through organisms and ecosystems, some of the matter reacts to release energy and life functions, some is stored in newly made structures, and some is eliminated as waste. This is the same exact thing as I just said at the top. Also, keep in mind when we're talking about conservation, we're looking at those processes that we mentioned on the previous page: photosynthesis, respiration, decomposition, and combustion. So big takeaways from this is if you think it's a photosynthesis or respiration question, every single time you want to write down the formula. And then you're going to match the formula, right, with the answer choices. The answer choices could be in a diagram form or they could be in a weird sentence. If you've written down the formula, you can answer the weird sentence ones. Also keep in mind, like a lot of the synonyms, plants, producers, autotrophs, phytoplankton, algae, they'll use those all to mean the same thing. And the last one is really just that matter is conserved, meaning saved. It stays the same. So however many carbon were here 1 million years ago, that's how many carbon are still here. It just might be stored in a different place than it used to be stored. Maybe it was originally in the geosphere and now it's in the atmosphere. Know the spheres. And then energy, when you move up the energy pyramid, what winds up happening is most of that energy is lost. 90% is lost. There's no recycling of energy. Energy just moves through the food pyramid. Most of it is lost. That was topic 2. I'm going to try to make the videos for the other topics as well. If you have questions, you could put them, ask me them, and I will try my best to answer them.